Alberta's massive healthcare overhaul was partially rolled out this week. Our Health Minister, Adriana LaGrange, will oversee the 4 pillars of the system. Now, to chat about the changes in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, what will the changes mean for the average Albertan? How will our healthcare allegedly improve under this new system?
Yeah, it's a little bit hard to say because you have to wonder if it's just sort of shuffling the deck chairs. Basically, what they've done is they're creating these 4 pillars, as you mentioned. Alberta Health Services will no longer sort of be this overarching sort of agency and will instead be responsible for delivering hospital care. So you have these sort of 4 agencies. They're all going to be reporting to Health Minister Adriana LaGrange, and there's the other part of it is the mental health and addiction stuff, which will be reporting to Dan Williams, who will also report to Adriana LaGrange. So it's basically just creating these 4 streams in hopes that will improve transparency. It will, hopefully improve, these agencies, they'll be focusing on one thing as opposed to trying to do multiple different things. There'll be perhaps more accountability, things like that. But it does seem so far like these are primarily changes at the political level in terms of, organizing from the top down, trying to figure out who's going to be responsible for what. So, at this point, I don't know if we're actually seeing any changes on the ground. It doesn't seem like it to me at this point. But there's been so many problems in the healthcare system over the last few years, hospital wait times and so on and so forth, that I think probably Albertans are looking for any sort of change that might improve things. And as this continues to roll out, then we might see some improvements in wait times, some reduction in surgery backlogs, things like that, hopefully. But it's a very confusing process, I have to say, and it'll be interesting to see just what this amounts to. I mean, as everyone knows, this is not the first time the system has been reorganized. It's probably been done a half dozen times in the last 15 years alone, I would say.
Last year, sadly, more than 1,800 Albertans died from opioid overdoses, Tyler. That's the highest number in provincial records. Now, some are calling into question the government's model of addiction recovery. But there's some good news, however, in that those dying from alcohol poisoning and cocaine overdoses continue to trend downwards.
Yeah, that's right. There's been a pretty substantial decline in the last few years, particularly in the number of alcohol poisoning deaths, I should say. So obviously, their opioids are trending upwards, and fentanyl is present in about 93% of those cases. But there are, a few bright spots, as you mentioned, cocaine and alcohol, which I think are the lowest levels they've been recorded in several years at least. Now, the Alberta government's sort of stance towards addiction and recovery has been, it's been very controversial. We've talked about it before. There's very much a focus on recovery. Alberta has not, for example, tried the drug decriminalization thing that British Columbia tried and subsequently got rid of because it didn't really work. So there's been more focus on recovery and less on harm reduction, I think is fair to say. Now, the one thing that hasn't happened yet that we've all kind of been waiting for is the legislation that would force or allow, I should say, courts to force people into addictions treatment. Now, that announcement when it came last year sometime was also very, very controversial. And the government has been studying that and considering how it's going to make that happen. So we haven't seen that yet. And, obviously we're almost 6 months into 2024, and I think I maybe would have expected it a little bit earlier. So I don't know if it'll come before the summer break, maybe next fall, but that's certainly something else to keep an eye on because that's going to be, a very, very big change to the way that Alberta is tackling addictions and recovery.
Even though many regions in our province have seen quite a bit of rain lately, Alberta still remains in a state of drought. Now, the moisture, however, has been helping firefighters battling that massive wildfire near Fort McMurray, which is now being held, used to be out of control. How about the rain helping a lot of our farmers?
Yeah, I mean, it's great news for the farmers. The moisture is sort of unambiguously a good thing. And Alberta is still abnormally dry. Pretty much abnormally dry is one of the qualifications that Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada uses. But there are also still drought conditions in much of the province. And the odd thing is that a lot of it seems to actually be in the northwestern part of the province, sort of the Peace region, which is actually typically quite a bit wetter. So there's some weird trends afoot there. But certainly southern Alberta's got a decent amount of rain. Central Alberta's got a decent amount of rain. So this is going to be good for the farmers that have got their crops in, and it's going to be a matter, I think, of hoping over the course of the summer that moisture continues because, the system itself is dry. We've had 2 or 3 years of quite dry weather, and so if you think of if you think of the ecosystem as a sponge or a dishcloth or something, it's dried out, and it's going to take multiple years of water to get that up to the level that it needs to be to sort of restore it to normalcy. So very good thing across the board. And the government, of course, has announced in I think it was late last month, a bunch of new agreements that are going to manage water use in some of the river basins in sort of southern and central Alberta. There is a whole drought management plan. We are still in stage 4 of the drought, which is the second to last step. The fifth is the state of emergency. So we could end up there. And if we end up there, of course, that will see some changes. Have some more political ramifications, I should say, because the provincial government will have given itself more powers to sort of dictate and restrict water use to make sure that, human health is prioritized and things like that. So what I would say is it's not a massive political story at this point, but certainly something happening in the background that I think we could see become a larger political story, if wildfires continue, if the rain does sort of drop off, that sort of thing.
I'm glad you mentioned the fact that it's been years since we've had dry springs and even not a lot of snowpack in the mountains in the wintertime too, because the reservoirs are really running dry, so it will take a long time to fill them back up once again, like you said. Now, last October, Tyler, the Supreme Court of Canada found that parts of Ottawa's Impact Assessment Act, or Bill C-69, were unconstitutional. Amendments have since been passed as part of the recent federal budget, but the Alberta government says the changes remain problematic and may take the fight back to court.
Yeah, so prepare for another round of Ottawa versus Alberta fisticuffs, perhaps. It's a little bit unclear to me specifically what they don't like about the new amendments, but we are perhaps in a situation where no amendment would have been particularly pleasing to the Alberta government. But this has been an ongoing controversy for it's got to be 5 years now over the Impact Assessment Act, which governs, of course, the approvals for large infrastructure projects, which would include mines, oil sands installations, potentially major highways. The court said last October that parts of it, that the federal government had overreached in its powers, and so there was this expectation that there were going to be amendments and consultations and so on and so forth. The amendments, of course, appeared in the federal budget, which is a massive document that all sorts of things get sort of shoved into. And the Alberta government says, we weren't consulted on it. We didn't have a chance to see the amendments. We weren't even given a heads up that this was in there. And the federal government, of course, says, well, we did consult with provinces and territories, so maybe they just didn't consult with Alberta. Bit of a mystery there, but I do think that we're going to see a little bit more of this, perhaps another court battle. Maybe it'll be successful, maybe it won't. Alberta's got, an okay record on fighting in court. Of course, they lost on the carbon tax, but won on Bill C-69. So I guess we'll have to see where that one goes. But that's certainly not a thing I see going away anytime soon. Probably a new federal government is the most likely way to resolve that particular point of contention between the province and the federal government.
Have to wait a while for that, though, not till October of 2025, Premier Daniel Smith says Bill 20, the new legislation that gives the province the power to force bylaw amendments or remove mayors or councillors, will not be used in the case of Calgary's rezoning legislation. And this is quite notable. Can you explain why?
Yeah, so Calgary went through this whole rezoning process, which was basically going to change residential zoning from sort of single-family detached homes to allowing various kinds of infill. This sort of follows what Edmonton did either earlier this year or late last year, and it was very, very controversial in Calgary. For a variety of reasons. People don't want their neighborhoods to change. They're concerned about parking, things like that. And so the city council in Calgary did pass this rezoning. Now, the reason this is not just a local Calgary story is because, as you mentioned, Bill 20. Now, the province, if it gives itself these powers to step in, could have, in theory, used that in this case. They might think that this was politically unpopular enough among some of their supporters that they would step in and have council modify that bylaw. Premier Daniel Smith saying they wouldn't, it maybe sets a little bit of a guardrail on where the provincial government would be willing to use this power. If they're not willing to use it in a case like this, something very, very controversial, then where is that line? I mean, it's got to be something even more controversial or even more problematic than this. So, there's been a lot of talk among municipal politicians and the municipal associations that represent cities that are very, very concerned about this provincial power, saying, that it to some extent neuters municipal politics, gives a lot more power to the provinces, things like that. But if they're not going to use it in something like this, they're maybe waiting for something even more outlandish. Maybe that's a little bit reassuring to some of the municipalities out there. I don't know if it will be because, politicians jealously guard their own powers. But it is a good sign, I think, that this is not going to just sort of completely abolish, in some ways, municipal government in Alberta.
Tyler, around half of the school boards in the province are going to pilot the UCP's latest rewrite of the elementary school curriculum. Of the 61 school boards, 35 are participating, plus a handful of charter schools. Now, you say this is a major change from what the 2021-2022 attempt to rewrite the curriculum. How so?
Well, so they've been working on a large curriculum rewrite of various subjects. It was specifically the social studies curriculum that was very, very controversial in 2021, 2022. And when they went to pilot that, I think you maybe had a half dozen charter schools that agreed to pilot it, and that was pretty much it. Nobody wanted to touch it. It was criticized by various experts. The Teachers Association opposed it. School boards clearly didn't like it if they didn't sign on to it. And so the UCP went back to the drawing board on this curriculum. And is now piloting it, and it's supposed to be rolled out for the start of the school year in 2025, I believe. So, yeah, I think it's about 35, as you said, school boards, and then some charter schools, independent schools, First Nations school as well, I believe. So, they're going to pilot it, give feedback. We'll see what the final curriculum looks like. But as you say, the reason this matters, the reason this is a big change is because it just doesn't seem to have been as controversial. There have been some criticisms of it. There's always going to be criticisms of this sort of thing, I think. But it does show that, perhaps they've gotten a little bit more certainly back on track with this rewrite of the social studies curriculum, to the extent that schools are actually willing to pilot it, which is, a pretty good sign, because if no one pilots it, how do you know how it's going to work when you roll it out fully? So a bit of progress being made on the social studies rewrite for sure.
The Alberta NDP will be choosing its new leader on June the 22nd, someone to replace Rachel Notley. Many would argue that former Calgary Mayor Naheed Nenshi is still the frontrunner. Tyler, many would also argue that he's a big reason why the party now has a very strong 85,000 members, and that's the largest it's ever been.
Yeah, it's quite a substantial increase. Tens of thousands of people more probably than it was at its previous high, and there's a few explanations. Well, maybe one explanation only actually for that, and that's possibly that Nenshi has brought aboard a whole bunch of people from Calgary who were previously his supporters as mayor. Now, I do think you tend to see growth in a party during a leadership race. It's not just Nenshi who's bringing in all of these people, but hidden in that 85,000 number is another sort of odd trend, which is that the number of NDP members in Calgary actually outnumber the NDP members in Edmonton. And Edmonton is historically the party's base, and Calgary has very much been a battleground during the elections. I think we've talked about this before. You need to win 2 or 3. You need Edmonton, Calgary, or rural Alberta, and you need two of those 3. And so you do have a bit of a shift in the dynamics within the NDP. If these people are Nenshi supporters, who's sort of a post-partisan purple army kind of guy, not necessarily an NDPer, what are the values that some of these new members from Calgary are bringing to the party? How are they going to gel with the members from Edmonton, who've perhaps been more lifelong sort of socialist-style NDPers? So it's just really interesting, I think, in terms of the internal party dynamics when it comes to things like a convention, when it comes to things like a policy platform, those sorts of things. If you have this much larger base is obviously very good when it comes to election time, but you can imagine some internal disagreements perhaps in the party. Now, 85,000 members, that's great. That's a whole bunch of volunteers, whole bunch of donors, good for fundraising. The question, of course, when you get to the election is how many of these people stick around, how many people who didn't vote in that last election end up voting for the UCP. So does it actually change the election day dynamics? Maybe not at the end of the day, but it certainly is a very, very interesting trend and does show, I think, that whoever leads the NDP into the next election is going to be leading a party at its most powerful, essentially, even if there are some internal fractures. But it's going to take some time, I think, to see just how significant some of those changes are to the NDP's actual sort of identity and ability to be an effective opposition.
Nenshi definitely has the support, but also a lot of people have been quite critical of him when he was the Calgary mayor. A lot of people are not happy with Naheed Nenshi. So who do you think could potentially be maybe his biggest competition? Would it be Sarah Hoffman, who's been very outspoken, or maybe Kathleen Ganley, who's focused more on the economy? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think both of them have put up a pretty serious fight. I hate to call it before it ends, but it does seem like Nenshi's running away with it. It does seem like Ganley and Hoffman have both been, a little more aggressive in the debates. trying to really take it to him. And as you say, on some of his faults, perhaps in the past, some of the other things he's done. There's that letter that he'd sent to Jason Copping when he was the labor minister, trying to get around some sort of union contract stuff that obviously was not going to play well with some aspects of the NDP's base. So it's a really strange situation because you want to pick a leader who everyone can get behind, but you also want to win if you're the other candidate. So how hard do you go after the guy you think is winning when you're going to need to work with them if you end up losing, and you're going to need to work with him if you end up winning? So it's a bit, I think, of an interesting dynamic between the candidates, and it took a long time, several months, I think, for them to start sort of going after Nenshi. All that said, I don't really expect it to become that much nastier in the next month because, why throw grenades on things when you're going to have to pick up the pieces down the road?
He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post. Tyler Dawson, thanks again for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me, Hal.